Alright everyone, let's start our class about Imperial Navy Slicer. So today we will talk about, I think, the most popular kiter in faction warfare. If you will find yourself a bit lost about terminology, when I recommend you to look at either Frigate yearbook or one of my previous lectures, where I go in a bit more detail about the styles of frigate PvP and how you should approach the general thinking about engaging and managing your fights. So for this class I will skip it, but if you want to watch the introduction, then just search for the yearbook and you will find the PDF and one of my previous lectures where I go into more detail on that. What are the topics for today? Well, first of all, we will talk about the ship itself, what's the slot layout, what are the bonuses, and what are the styles that suits this ship the best. When we will talk about the most popular feats, what are the strengths and weaknesses, when a bit of a general topic on how to pick and manage your fights when you use a kiting ship. This is maybe not as familiar to you as using a Scrum specific ships like Comets or Hookbills. So I want to go a bit more into detail on that. When, as usual, we will talk about the engagement map for this ship, so what you can fight, what you shouldn't fight, and so on, and the short Q&A at the end. Overall, I think this one should be pretty quick, but in any case, it should be less than 1 hour. Okay, let's talk about the ship profile. The Slicer is a MAR combat navy frigate. One of the 4 combat navy frigate in line with the Hookbill, Comet and Firetail. It has a pretty unusual slot layout with 3 high slots, 2 medium slots and 5 low slots, and bonuses to laser damage and optimal. So when you see it, usually it means that this ship will lean towards kiting, because it's quite difficult to manage fights inside scrum range with only 2 medium slots. It's possible, and we will talk a bit about brawling slicers at the end, but primarily when you think about slicer, it will kite, because it has a nice synergy between optimal range, 5 low slots and 2 medium slots. What would be the main strengths for this ship? Why would you want to use it? Well, first of all, it has an excellent application for a kiter. Like in terms of raw damage output, it may not look very impressive. For example, you can take, I don't know, like a kiting Tristan or light missile prop fleet, load like a highest damage ammo, like a Fury missile, and then it will look kind of comparable. But actually, when you consider application, then Slicer is the best kiter in terms of applied damage. For example, if you compare it against light missile kiters that fight against like an afterburner or even micro-warp drive frigates, it will apply almost 3 times as much damage as light missile kiter. And against, if you compare it against drone ships, again, drone ships have a certain on paper DPS, but in reality the DPS will be a bit lower, because drones have to chase targets and they have to track the target as well. So in reality, especially if it's like a kiter against kiter matchup, drone ships will apply significantly less when the on-paper damage, while Slicer will pretty much always apply close to full damage. So that's like the main reason why you want to use a Slicer, because you can output and apply a lot of DPS, and you can kill some ships quite quickly compared to other types of kiters. Because of that, well, at least partially because of that, you can be quite aggressive when you pick fights. For example, when you fight like an afterburner frigate in a light missile kiter, it will take you quite a long time to kill it because of damage application. But with Slicer, you can kill it quite quickly because your damage is quite respectable. So your opponent usually has a limited time to call for backup if he is losing. While if you're using like a drone ship or light missile kiter, sometimes you will be chased out by the backup. I assume you fight solo and your opponent may be solo, maybe not. And final key strength, this is pretty common for any kiting ship, is a wide engagement profile. Because you rely on speed and distance to tank, you can engage quite many different ships. As long as you can mitigate the damage, you can fight the ship. So when you fight in a scrum range ship, it's always a matter of tank and DPS, usually. But here, your engagement profile just gets very wide, because if a ship cannot apply damage to you, when you don't really care how much on paper tank or on paper DPS does this ship have. What about weaknesses? Well, there are plenty of them actually. Well, first of all, like the most basic thing is that Slicer requires excellent core skills. By core skills, I mean your character skill points, primarily on capacitor and all things related to weapons, like optimal range, tracking, damage, and so on. Unfortunately, it's not really a beginner-friendly ship, even when we are talking only about like a skill point thing, because it's very on the limit, even with perfect engineering and weapon skills. And if you go away from like all top 5, all 5 levels, it gets progressively worse and significantly worse. And you can't really substitute the lack of skill points with some adjustments to the fit, because fits are extremely optimized, and once you go away from the optimized way to fit a Slicer, it also gets kinda bad. So yeah, like if you have a relatively fresh character without a lot of skill points into engineering and weapons, then Slicer may not perform very well. Well, it's also quite predictable, because, as I said before, usually Slicers will kite. They are not really suited for anything else. And it's a pretty big downside when you fly a kiting ship when everyone expects you to kite, because you will have less opportunities to have a favorable engagements. It's kind of like a rock, paper, scissors. People will not fight you in afterburner frigates out of position, because they know they will just lose because you will kite and they are close range. So it's a bit of a problem, and it requires you to approach the engagement slightly differently. We will talk about it closer to the end of this class. For now, I just want to throw this idea here. It's also quite unforgiving when you fly like a light missile kiter, like a probe fleet or a Garmur or even a Condor. Usually you have plenty of med slots, medium slots, and you can put some defensive modules there. For example, Garmurs will quite often have a defensive scrum, so we can screen off an anti-kiter who tries to scrum them. Or like a probe fleet or a Condor will often have a tracking disruptor to reduce the incoming damage. But Slicer obviously has none of it, because you only have 2 slots, and these 2 slots will be your prop module and your tackle. So every time you make a mistake, there is usually no coming back from it. You can't like mitigate some damage or screen off a guy who is trying to scrum you. And it can be quite frustrating to fly a Slicer, because every time you make a mistake, you usually will die. Especially combined with the fact that it's quite predictable. And the final thing is that Slicer is very limited on capacitor. When you fly like an optimal Slicer fit, just by running your guns, prop module and tackle, you will cap out in about a minute. You don't even rep, just from shooting your guns, tackling, and using your micro warp drive, you will cap out in a minute. So it's again quite difficult to manage, especially if you're new and tend to tunnel vision a bit. You will find yourself out of cap very quickly. And even if you can manage your cap, we will talk about methods and techniques you can use to kind of get around it. You can't really fight for long, like you can't really kill a cruiser simply because you just don't have enough cap to sustain a long engagement. Actually, Slicer can't even shoot guns and tackle at the same time for a long time. It will cap out just from that. You don't even run your micro warp drive and you still cap out in like 2.5 minutes. So that's a bit of a problem, but that's just something that many MR laser frigates have when they don't have a bonus for energy capacitor use. It's just like a game design thing. Final thing that I want to say here is what kind of Slicers will you encounter if you fight against them. Many people assume that Slicers are fitted with pulse lasers, but actually by statistics on kill boards, it's about 50-50 between pulse and beam. And we will talk about both of these fits and how they're different and how you can counter them. So here just keep in mind that it's about 50-50 between these 2 popular fits. Okay, a very quick comment on this slide. This slide shows on the x-axis the number of 1v1 engagements in faction warfare space, and on the y-axis is the average win rate excluding mirrors. This is for the last 2 years, so 2020, 2022 and 2023. As you can see, Slicer is the 3rd popular Navy frigate in the game and the 5th popular frigate overall. And it's pretty decent. Probably not as strong as Comet, especially considering how difficult it is to use Slicer optimally. But it's pretty usable, pretty good ship, especially if you want to learn kiting. Okay, let's talk about fits. I will go from the most popular to the least popular fits. The most popular, the most basic slicer is the pulse kiter slicer. How do you fit this ship? Well, firstly, you have two weapon slots and you use the largest pulse lasers in both of them, obviously, because you need the longest possible optimal range for kiting. You don't usually use anything in your utility high here. It's kinda useless for the design of this ship. The medium slots are your prop module and your tackle, obviously. And the low slots are usually double heatsink, double nano, and ancillary rep. This is, I would say, the standard. You can't really do anything differently because you need the maximum damage to make fights as short as possible because of limitations on your capacitor. You also need both speed and agility, so it's nanos and not overdrives. And you kind of need something to repair, like some minor damage, maybe between fights, maybe during the fights when you like pull out of the actual engagement. But usually you don't repair during the actual fight simply because you don't have enough cap. And for rig slots, it's always 3 rigs on optimal range because without them your pulse lasers don't have enough range with Scorch to effectively kite at the edge of tackle range. So as you can see, with 3 rigs on optimal range, it's more or less matches the optimal range with your tackle range, which is 24 kilometers unheated and 28 kilometers heated. If you can, it's good to use Frentix booster. It will add like I think 1 or 2 kilometers, standard Frentix booster, 1 or 2 kilometers on your optimal range. Not critical, but nice to have. You will generally apply a little bit more damage at the edge of tackle range. Okay, what you should keep in mind here. Well, first of all, look at your capacitor. 1 minute 10. This is without ancillary rep. So, as I said before, just from shooting guns, running your micro warp drive, and tackling, you will cap out in a minute. And if your skills are not perfect, then it will be even shorter. So just keep it in mind. There are no real ways around it because mind flood boosters have horrible side effects for this ship, like a penalty on optimal range, which you really don't want. And cheaply, I think you can only upgrade your macro warp drive by using 2% implant on CPU. This will give you 10 additional seconds on your cap. Other ways are pretty inefficient, like you shouldn't really replace anything with capacitor related modules because you really want like double heatsink and double nano. Slicer is actually not very fast ship naturally and not very agile, so you kind of need to boost these stats with double nano. Just for comparison, Slicer with double nano is just barely faster than the Comet without any modules on speed or agility. Yeah, and you can't really use anything for the rig slots apart from optimal range because you really need optimal range. It's like defines your efficiency. Okay, what are the strengths and weaknesses for this specific fit? Well, it's pretty high damage, 190 DPS, and you will apply pretty much all of it because your tracking is amazing for a kiter, like 230 tracking for a ship that will operate at the edge of point range is amazing. You will apply even on afterburner frigates pretty much all of your damage. It's very cheap. 18 million for a faction frigate is just really, really cheap. Like some hook bills can go up to 40 million with pretty like a baseline fits, and the Comet will go up to 30, I think. So even like for a navy frigate, it's really, really cheap. And it's quite easy to fit. Usually, well, not usually, but quite often, frigate optimal frigate fits are quite tight, and if your skills are not perfect, you may struggle a bit to fit the optimal fit. But here it's quite easy. Usually your bottleneck is power grid, but here it's okay. Weaknesses. Well, your main weakness is the range, because if you want to apply any significant damage, you kind of have to be within 24 kilometers. Usually, kiters engage, well, not usually, but quite often, you engage against multiple opponents, and you kind of want to clear the grid a little bit before you commit. So for example, hookbill, light missile hookbill, you have like 45 kilometers range, and you can just shoot without committing, and maybe you can push someone off the grid, and after that you commit. But here it's impossible. Like you have 25 kilometers, so you kind of have to be within your tackling range. It kind of limits your flexibility on grid. Every time you want to apply damage, you have to be like relatively close for a kiter, obviously. And it's quite capacity limited. It's not the worst thing, as you will see, 1 minute 10. But if you're fighting against like anti-kiting Comet with MWD, a Comet can pressure you constantly, because for Comet it can run MWD no problem at all, without feeling any pressure on his cap, and you can't run your MWD and point and guns full on because you only have a minute. So if you fight against opponents that can constantly pressure you with their own micro warp drive, then it can be quite tricky to kill them before you run out of cap. The alternative is the beam kiter. It essentially is the same feat, but you just replace your pulses with beams. The rest is essentially the same. So what are the trade-offs? On the one hand, you get more damage within the same range, I should say. So like at the edge of your point range at 24 kilometers, beam feet will have more damage. And if we go like closer, then it will apply as well. So generally, if we compare damage for pulse and beam slicers at the same engagement range, beam slicers will have more damage. Well, at least more theoretical damage. And you get more flexibility because, as you can see, at 24 kilometers, I'm using like a second close range ammo. Multi-frequency is the first one. I'm not talking about Gleam, like Tech 2 close range, but like Imperial Navy multi-frequency is where you use your closest range, when Gamma, when X-ray. So you can shoot up to 24 kilometers with Gamma, and if you fit like a Standard or Aurora, when you will shoot for the entire lock-in range, which is 50 kilometers for Slicer. So it kind of removes the problem of okay, when I have to apply damage, I have to be in point range. With this fit, you don't have to be in point range to apply damage, because you have a way longer range with beams. What are the disadvantages? Well, on the other hand, your capacitor is pretty horrible. Actually, I forgot to turn on the warp disruptor here. It will be like 50 seconds, as far as I remember, with warp disruptor on. So you will cap out even faster with beams, because we use mockup. And your tracking is significantly worse. So with this fit, you actually have to think about like transversal matching, basically reducing your transversal to apply full damage. Because if you just orbit like an afterburner frigate, your actual applied damage will be worse than a pulse slicer, even though your paper damage is higher. So what does it mean? Well, it means just beam fit is more difficult to handle because of worse capacitor, worse tracking, and in general, if you get caught with pulse slicer, you can use multi-frequency and maybe apply some damage, but with beam fit, if you're caught, your tracking is just so bad that I don't think you can even do something about it. Yeah, so as I said, like strength, great damage, long range. It's also very cheap, and it's also easy to fit. It's the same basically, the last 2 points. And the weaknesses are pretty poor tracking and very capacitor limited. So in theory, I think like the more experienced guys maybe prefer beam fit, because it just gives you a bit more flexibility on grid, and it's a bit better if you extract the maximum out of it. But for beginners, I would definitely recommend starting with a pulse fit. It's quite difficult to manage to begin with, and going with beams, you just will struggle a lot just from your macromanagement mistakes. Okay, before we go into like a brawling slicers, I want to talk a bit about how you should approach your engagements when you fly kiting slicers, which will be the majority of situations. It slightly differs from all Scrum range ships. The first principle is that you have to be active. Because when you fight 1v1, people will know what you are going to do, and they will not give you generally a good, they will not give you like good odds to engage them. For example, like an afterburner comet, if you don't catch him somewhere out of position, he will probably sit inside the plex at 0, and you kind of will have to warp into him and then just pray that you will be able to burn away from scrums. But if you actively look for fights, for example, you see, I don't know, 2 or 3 ships inside plex, and you have some reasoning to assume that they are fighting against each other. Maybe it's like 2 versus 1, but they are not all together. When you should slide in and try to burn away, there is a pretty good chance that they will not be on warping, they will not be ready, that they maybe don't check discan at all, because they're busy fighting. People usually tunnel vision and they don't spam discan during the fight, and so on. And you can get into a better position and then kill someone. You should like attack large ships, like destroyers and up. Usually destroyers, we will talk a bit about like destroyer specific things when we get to engagement profile. But as a general rule, you have to remember that large ships cannot control you. If you slide into a destroyer, he will not be able to tackle you before you burn away. We simply don't have enough scan resolution to tackle a frigate inside the scrum range if you do everything correctly. So if he can apply enough damage, then he will force you off a grid, but he shouldn't be able to kill you if you do everything correctly. So you should always, when you see like a large ship inside a plex, like a cruiser or destroyer, you should always try to do something about it. Like go in and try to check what's going on. And if it doesn't work, like if he is an artillery feed or if it's a, I don't know, like a ship with drones and he forces you away, it's fine. You just leave because he can't tackle you. But very often you will find that it's like a blast catalyst or something like this, and you just kill him because he can't do anything against Slicer. So you should find for these opportunities. Look for these opportunities because they will give you some kills, and if you do everything correctly, you shouldn't really die in these situations. You can also do some creative things like just chill outside of plexus, and when people descan you, they will assume that you are inside because that's typically what frigates do, and when they will warp outside your plex to maybe prepare for a fight and I don't know, wait for the backup or anything like this. People usually do that, and then you can just catch them outside. There are many other tricks to do, but generally one thing to remember is that in a kiting ship you have to be active. You have to take risks because you are not in a ship that commits to a fight. So if a fight is unfavorable, you usually can leave if you do everything correctly. Okay, let's talk about some mechanical things. If these will be a bit theoretical and difficult to visualize in your head, then I recommend searching for like Slicer PvP videos. I think Chesser had a pretty good ones many years ago. It didn't really change since then. For now, just I will just talk you through some basic mechanics. First off, when you engage like a group of ships or a single ship in faction warfare, usually it means that they want to fight. They don't like run away from you, because if they didn't want to fight, they probably would have warped off from the plex to begin with. So you can for a while just apply damage with your prop mode on, but don't actually tackle them because your warp disruptor eats a lot of cap, and if your opponent is not going to warp out soon anyway, when you don't really need to waste cap tackling him. It requires a bit of experience to understand when the fight is quite decisively going into your favor and when you actually have to tackle a guy when he is about to warp off. But generally for Slicer it's an extremely important skill to not waste cap on tackling things that are not going to warp out anyway, because you're so limited on cap that even if you squeeze like a 30 seconds out of your capacitor by doing this, then it's often a difference between getting a kill and getting killed. Next one, when you chase someone, it's always very risky in a kiting ship because you can look at this picture. When you turn on your, how does it call, a tactical overview, I think, it shows the vector of movement for every ship on grid. And experienced opponents will understand where you are going on grid from this movement vector, and they can plot their own movement vector to intercept you by just double clicking in space. They don't click approach or orbit, they just double click in space to catch you, assuming where you will be in like 10 seconds according to your movement vector. And it's quite difficult to adjust this vector when you are chasing someone, because when you have micro warp drive on, you have a lot of inertia, and your ship will be very slow to turn or even change direction in general. So as a general rule, when you fight in a kiting ship, you want people to chase you because it gives you a lot of safety. You will see if we are faster or if we are slower, and you will have a lot of space in front of you to maneuver because people will not be on your way. It's not always possible, but it's a good thing to remember, especially when engagement just starts and you know that your opponents will not warp out immediately. It's a good tactic to let them chase you for a bit. And if you want to chase someone, when you shouldn't approach or use outer orbit. You can test it. It will be probably quite difficult to visualize right now, but you can test it just against some immovable object and see how your ship reacts when you click on these commands. For example, when you click approach, the ship will go in a straight line to the target, which is really not what you want to do when you fight in a kiting ship, for the reasons that I just mentioned. And similarly, outer orbit is very inflexible. So for example, let's assume you are like 20 kilometers off your target, and your target is not moving, let's assume, and you click outer orbit. What's gonna happen is outer orbit like 24 at the edge of your tackling range. What's gonna happen is that your ship will basically stop and then turn around to get into the higher orbit. And again, this is not what you want, because if this situation happens when both ships are moving, you're just gonna get scrammed. Because by the time your ship turns around, it just takes so long against an opponent who understands what you're doing that you're just gonna get scrammed. And similarly, if you issue orbit command when you're outside of your desired orbit, so let's say you're at 30 and you click orbit 20, the approach vector will not be direct, but it will be at a quite a sharp angle. So a ship will try to go into orbit as quickly as possible. It will not be like at a 45-degree angle relative to your orbit, but it will be quite sharp. And what it means is that you will overshoot your orbit quite a bit, and then the game will turn your ship around again, and you will lose a lot of speed. So what you want to do is to like click at like 45 degrees relative to your orbit, to have to basically not appear in a situation where you have to do sharp turns. Every time you have to do sharp turns in a kiting ship, it's a bad sign, because you will lose a lot of speed and you will kind of sit in one space for a while. So every time you move and change your positions, you have to use pretty like moderate angles to give yourself some flexibility to move one way or the other. Yeah, again, it takes a bit of practice, and actually quite a lot of practice, but this is just the basics that you have to keep in mind to understand what's going wrong when you're kiting. Uh, Usually these things go wrong. People just click out of orbit, and experienced players know the movement that your ship will take, and they know how to intercept it. Okay, so this is it for kiting slicers. Let's talk a bit about the brawling variations. These are quite rare, but you should be prepared, because sometimes it's easy to tunnel vision and assume that any slicer is kiting. There are many things, there are many ways to fit a brawling slicer. This is just one way that I personally prefer, but it's not the only one, and maybe it's not even the best one. Generally, these feats appeared after the surgical strike in 2020, when CCP buffed the damage for Tech 2 close range armor. So uh, for laser ships, for laser ships that use pulses, it's conflag. So conflag will now have more DPS than before. Well, not now, like 4 years ago already. And people started experimenting with slicer fits that would be like max DPS close range ships. So what you can do, you can fit like an afterburner and a web for application. You can also fit scrums. You can fit macro warp drive and scrum, macro warp drive and web. There are many combinations. And then for the low slots and for rigs, you do it like a typical frigate. So you hull tank it to not have any negative impact on your speed, and you add ancillary rep, and then you just add as much damage as you can, which is two hits in this case. And you have one DPS rig as well on top of it. You can fit it differently. You can fit it with like an armor tank. You will get a bit more EHP, but a lot less speed. It's also possible. But the general idea for all of these feats is that you just sit in plexus. You can even sit outside of your optimal range, somewhere like 20 kilometers, to force people to think that you are actually a kiting slicer. You can sit at zero as well. And then you just try to overwhelm the incoming ship with your DPS. Your DPS is pretty respectable, 340 without any like drugs or implants. I think with everything you can go up to 400, which is pretty good. And with web you will have a decent application, and you don't even need to sit at zero because you still have like 6 kilometers of your range. So you can kind of like scrum kite. Not really scrum kite, but not brawl either. Like be somewhere in the middle. And just hope that the person doesn't notice, and you can kill him before he warps off. You can also have scrums to avoid this, but then you may struggle with tracking, and in general with control, with range control. But it's possible as well. I have seen these feats quite a lot initially, but now I don't see them quite often, or I haven't seen them in a while actually on any of my characters. but you just have to be prepared for this opportunity, especially when you fight like a slicer that you think that should be kiting, but he behaves kind of weirdly. And when you like tackle him, when suddenly you have 350 DPS in your face. Um, yeah, but how do you counter it? Well, first of all, usually you can simply warp out. Even when we have Scrum, they usually won't have enough control to keep you in Scrum range because they're just Afterburner and the Scrum. These ships also cannot obviously outbrawl a proper brawler. For example, a Comet will win against this ship. Comet will have like 7k EHP plus higher DPS. So if you are like in a anti-kiter or brawler, you're not really afraid of these ships. And if you are in a Scrum Kiter or any other control-oriented frigate, when you probably want to win, but you can always leave because it's lack of control. But it can be quite unpredictable. You just have to keep it in mind when you engage slicers that this is a possibility. Pretty rare, but still a possibility. Okay, finally let's talk about the engagement map. So this is the data for every 1v1 engagement in faction warfare with Slicer against each of these ships. And there are a number of kills for Slicer, number of losses for Slicer, and the average win rate. And it's sorted from the most popular matchups on the left to the least popular matchups on the right. Okay, let's talk about what you can engage. Well, Tech 1 frigates usually quite easy. You have to keep in mind that some attack and fast Tech 1 frigates can be fitted as an anti-kiter, and in this case it can be a bit tricky, like fighting an anti-kite Itron or a breacher or even a slasher can be kind of difficult, but you have to remember that these ships, even though they probably will scrum you eventually because simply they're much faster, they also have very little tank. So they will be on a massive timer every time. Usually, from my experience, when I fly like Tech 1 anti-kiter against a slicer, I have one try to scrum a slicer. If my first try is unsuccessful, when I don't have enough tank to kill it, even if my second attempt is successful. So usually you have one attempt, and if it's unsuccessful, you have to bail for these matchups. For the rest, it should be quite simple, assuming that you will fight like some standard afterburning frigates. There are not much they can do. And we don't have that much tank to put any pressure on your capacitor. So you should engage all of it every time, the entire group. The Navy frigates, well, there are a couple of important matchups here. First of one is against a Comet. When you fight against a Comet, you kind of want to probe whether it's an MWD fit or an afterburner fit. If it's an MWD, then it will be quite difficult. I mentioned it already because Comets can just pressure you constantly with MWD. They do not have any issues with cap, and they have a lot of buffer tank. So they don't really need to run the ancillary rep, even when you DPS them down. So they have probably like 2 or 3 attempts easily before they have to bail. And by the time they make like 3 attempts to scram you, you probably will be close to no cap yourself. So it's just quite difficult to manage these fights. And if we're an afterburner, then it's doable, but if we're in position, it's always like a 50-50 whether or not you will be able to burn away from scrum, because comets are pretty fast, even with afterburner. Hook bills will, well, with hook bills it's usually down to who can catch who. If we're an afterburner, you're quite safe. They don't have projection and they don't have enough speed to do anything. But otherwise, if they will catch you, then of course they will kill you. So it's like it's really down to your initial engagement selection, whether or not you can engage favorably or not. Firetail, pretty much the same situation as the Comet. When it's an MW defeat, it's quite difficult. It's even more difficult, I think, than against the Comet. When it's an afterburner, it's doable. Vigil Fleet is always difficult because Vigil Fleet will have like a 24-kilometer web. It's doable, but you just have to remember it. As usual, like as I said before, you may look at it and say, well, 21% against the same class is kind of bad, but remember that it's 1v1 fights only. And as I said before, the fair share of your kills will be actually third party. So when you aggressively look for fights, and maybe you push one of the ships away, and then you finish off the other. And it will not count as a solo kill, obviously, but it's a kill and you will hold the grid. But it's just not counted here. So in reality, if you use slicers correctly, you will get like way more than 1 to 5, obviously. Against pirate frigates, it's quite difficult. You should engage Garmors. Slicers actually kill Garmors quite reliably because in a kiter versus kiter, and pulse lasers or beam for that matter out damage light missiles by quite a bit. So Garmors have to be very careful when they engage slicers. It's as you can see 31% is quite high. And the rest it's always difficult. Like Dramiel is just a natural anti-kiter, Worm will just kill you with drones, Daredevil is an anti-kiter with 90% web, also difficult. Astero has drones and a ton of tanks, so you won't really be able to kill any properly fitted Astero. Succubus is like a slicer but much better, and these are so rare that you probably never see them really. Okay, destroyers. Destroyers, it comes down to whether or not you have, or they have long-range weapons or not. So if they do have long-range weapons, you can't kill them, and if they have short-range weapons, then you can. So what you do generally is that you warp into them, you check their guns by taking some damage or just looking at their ship, and then you decide whether you want to stay or leave. One key consideration is that Slicer dies very quickly to like an artillery thrasher. It's like maybe 3 volleys and you will be dead. So you have to decide very quickly. Same with like a rail cormorant, like rail catalyst, beam coercers, and so on. So you just poke, you see the guns, and if it's a long range guns, you usually leave. And if it's a short range guns, then you can engage. So like an autocannon thrasher is completely killable, blaster catalyst is killable, rail cormorant is killable. Usually you will have enough cap to break the tank before you run out. Drone ships are not really killable, but sometimes they have like horrible sets that can't really catch you, and in this case you may try. So Algazes and Dragoons can be a bit difficult, depending on the feats. Pretty much the same logic applies to Navy frigates, Navy destroyers. It will be more difficult because Navy destroyers have better projection. So like a Navy Cormorant blaster Navy Cormorant with null loaded may actually kind of scratch you at 20 kilometers, 20-24 kilometers, which can be a bit of a problem. But the general approach is the same. You check for guns. If it's a long range, you leave. If it's a short range, you can engage. Yeah, obviously don't fight Kikimeras. A minute of silence for 208 slicers who try to outkite Kikimeras. It doesn't work. With cruisers, you can't really do anything simply because you don't have enough cap to just grind through the tank. Like my experience, for example, with Moas, like yes, they can't do anything against slicers. You just kill the free drones, and then you just shoot the Moa, and it will not be able to apply any damage to you. But it will take just too long for you to kill a cruiser, and you're always cap limited. So you kind of have to tackle them, otherwise they will leave, and you kind of have to activate your guns, otherwise they won't die. And just by activating your tackle and guns, you will cap out in like 3 minutes, and you won't kill a cruiser in 3 minutes. So it's you can try if it's like a completely horrible feat, then maybe you will be able to, but generally it's impossible to kill a cruiser solo in a slicer if it's moderately decently fit and knows what he is doing. But he won't be able to kill you either if you know what you're doing. Assault frigates, the only like a feature that you have to remember is that you can't fight Min Matar 2 frigates because they will have racial resists against EM and thermal, which is your DPS. So you just won't have any applied DPS to them. This is Jaguar and Wolf, as you can see, like 2% and 7%. That's the reason. For the rest, generally you can. Again, you may struggle with cap because these ships usually have a lot of tank plus ancillary or assault damage control. So you may just not have enough time to kill them. And they will be considerably more agile than cruisers, so you probably won't be able to turn off your prop module at all as well. So it's just practically quite tricky to secure a kill. And with retributions, you have to remember that the majority of retributions will kite, and kiting retributions are just beta slicers. So in this case, you have to bail immediately. They will just be a bit slower. And this rare stuff, usually I would say just avoid. You can like poke at the tech-free destroyers using the same principle as against Tech 1 and Navy. If they are long range fit, then you should leave. If they are close range, then you can probably try to do something. But it will be quite difficult as well because of combination of their agility and projection and tank that you have to burn through. And interceptors are quite rare. I personally haven't seen like an interceptor in faction warfare in a while. So to summarize, all Tech 1 and Navy frigates you can fight. All Tech 1 destroyers, well, I should probably say close range Tech 1 and Navy destroyers because you won't realistically win like against artillery thrasher anyway. All assault frigates except Min Matar, and Garmors and some like weak pirate frigates like Damavic and Crower probably can engage with some care. And larger ships you generally should avoid. Yeah, I think this is everything I wanted to say. If you have any questions, then please ask them on Discord or in voice. How much time? Oh, we actually spent an entire hour on that. It's so surprising. I thought we will be much faster. Okay, I have a question which is like 1 hour ago. What do AK, B, SK and everything else mean at the top? So this is on this slide. This is the style that frigates usually employ. So anti-kiter is the ships that will be fitted with MWD, Scram and Web, and they are designed to catch kiters. Brawlers are close-range, well-tanked ships. Scram kiters are ships that fight at the edge of scram range, so at like 7 to 9 kilometers. Web kiters are ships that fight at the edge of web range, so 13 kilometers approximately, and they use web and the long point. And kiters are ships that fight at the edge of warp disruptor range of 24 kilometers. I recommend looking into Frigates Yearbook or one of my previous lectures. You can find them on EVUNI, and I have recordings available. I had a lecture for Navy Comet and Navy Hookbill, and for these lectures I included like a 10-minute intro on the styles and why they're important. So just search them on scheduled classes on EVUNI and watch like first 6 or 7 minutes of these lectures and you will understand it better. Yeah, sorry that I missed your question initially and you had to listen for me for an hour not understanding what's going on. Yeah, I will probably add the legend for the future. Yeah, alright, the recording will be available as usual. I plan to run additional classes on other ships. If you're interested in them, then please join or watch recordings. If you're interested in Comet or Hookbill, then I already run classes for these ships and the recordings are available. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you will join the future classes as well. Thank you.